Welcome back, CSE 121, Fall 2020, to part 2 of our Turtle Squares CMYK exercise, that is introducing functions, function calls, parameters, arguments, using variables, loops, all kinds of things we're going to do in here with the Turtle module. And so far we just drew one red square, first of all, without using a function, and then using a function and a function call, except now we want to make more, but we don't want them to be red squares, and we don't want them to be in the same position. So a couple things we're going to have to do here is get rid of the position, because this is kind of absolute. This is locked in here. So we're going to kind of change that here, and you can do something. I think you could even put xy if you want, but I think what I'll do is just call it stx, sty for start x and start y. Now I think you could just use xy, but we'll do that so it's a little more descriptive. And we could always put comments in here if we want. But before I do anything else, and actually let me get rid of this too, and just as like a kind of a variable, but not a true variable, but just as a placeholder here, instead of color, since we're going to have different colors here, I'm just going to put CLR for color. Now I could have put color, and I could have put C or something, but we're going to use a couple more variables. So let me do that first. I'm going to make some variables up here, and I'll just make a comment and call them variables, just so I know they are. And I'm going to do variables for CMYK. So I'm going to say C equals, and I'm only doing this because we're going to do them in hex, just because it's good to use hex once in a while, just to keep your mind fresh on what hex was, since we did an exercise on hex. But we're going to have to put this in quotes, and hex needs a pound sign, and the first one, cyan, is going to use green and blue. So that means it's going to be 0, 0 for the red, and then for the green, it's going to be FF. It's going to be full power of the green, and then for the blue it's going to be full power, and that's going to be cyan, and don't forget the pound sign. And now what you could do is you can just copy this, and we'll just do it in order. So now we're going to have magenta, and this color is going to have red, so it's going to be FF. It's not going to have any green, so that'll be 0, 0, and it'll have blue. So magenta is basically red and blue. You would think it would be purple, but remember, combining RGB colors is a little bit different. It makes kind of a pinkish color. So that's the magenta. And you could write these down if you're not sure, but hopefully the C and the M will remind you. I don't know if we need comments for those. And then we're going to have Y, which is going to be yellow. And I should have probably just pasted it, but I forgot to, so I'll just type it in. And it'll be FF for the red, FF for the green, because it uses red and green to make yellow, which again, it's not like ink, so it's a little different. And 0, 0, because there's no blue in yellow. And for the last one, we're going to use K. And actually, for anybody who's not familiar with CMYK, those are like the ink colors. K actually stands for keyline, because it used to be the keyline black color, which would kind of help register the other ink colors in place. That's why it doesn't use B, it uses K. And K, some people think K is for the K at the end of black, but it's not. It's for keyline. So you can do anything here. You could put in the word black. You can put 0, 0. We can just stay consistent with hex and just put in our quote, and we'll put in 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Now you can shorten these and do FF0, F0F, but we'll just keep them the full hex colors right now. So those are our hex colors. So if we need to use colors, all this means is if we need to use a color, we're just going to use these letters. We don't have to throw in some long thing somewhere else. These represent those hex numbers, so whenever we need a color, we'll use these. And regardless if we're using parameters and arguments, we're still going to use these. We can still use these as an argument if we want to. So what I'm going to do down here is, let's say we want this one. We'll start here. I think when I showed my sample, I went cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. I went in counterclockwise order for some reason, but I'm going in counterclockwise. So I'm going to start here with cyan. Now, if you wanted to make this cyan, now right now I put nothing here. So if I run it here, let me just see what happens. I get an error because it doesn't know what CLR is, because it's not defined. It's doing nothing. And we have to say what CLR is, and CLR is just waiting for something here. Now, you could just do C. You might say, well, why don't you just put C in here? And that's fine, except now that's the same thing as putting red in there. So putting C in there is just putting the absolute value. Now, we still have kind of holders in here. So these three places, we have holders. And I'm not going to use C here. I'm going to use CLR as a holder. because we could just assume these are actual values. So I'm not going to put an actual value in there. I'm going to put a holder. So these things are little kind of temporary variables that we're going to use. So these are variables that aren't declared out here. They're kind of declared in here. They're almost like local variables, but they're not really declared. It's just a different kind of way. We'll talk about local variables and global variables, but these are used only within the function. They're special variables that are used in here. Now, they're not being used yet. Now, the way we kind of declare them in a way is we can go up here and say, hey, okay, we're going to need CLR and a comma, and we're going to need STX, comma, and we're going to need STY. So in order to define this function, we're going to need values for these three things because we don't have them here. We don't have a CLR, we don't have an STX, and we don't have an STY. And so that's basically saying these are sort of variable declarations if you think of it in a weird way. You could actually declare them in here. You can say CLR equals something, STX equals something, and something else equals something. CLR equals C. And if I did STX equals 0 and STY equals 0, and I run it, it'll actually run it. But we're going to do it a different way. We're not going to put them in here. We're actually going to send them with the function call because we're going to use multiple ones. Because now, again, this is just making it a one-off kind of thing. So we want to make it more flexible. So that's kind of what's happening. I just wanted to show that because that's kind of what's happening here. Oh, and one thing I didn't do, I just noticed, is we could run this thing a little bit faster. If it's running a little slow, right here as one of the properties, we could go t.speed. And it goes kind of like from 0 is like the super fastest. And then it goes like 1, 2, 3. 1 is really slow. 3 is kind of in between. It kind of goes like that. And then 10 is very fast. I'm going to use like an 8. And I'll show you where to find this stuff. But just trust me, 8 is kind of a pretty fast. It's a little bit faster. So when we run this, it'll go a little faster. And nothing's happening right now because, again, we didn't take care of this stuff yet. So you'll see the speed in a minute. Because actually, let's look and see what it says. It says type error, draw square. And that's talking about the function. It's saying it takes 3 arguments and 0 are given. So we didn't give them any arguments. So these things are waiting for the values. Just like I said, if I give them a value up here or something, like C, then I'm giving them a value. But right now they don't have any values and we're getting an error because we have no arguments. So we're going to put arguments down here and I'm going to say C and comma, and I'll say 0, comma, 0 because that's where our first one was starting. So this is our first one. This is our cyan one in the upper right, which starts at 0, 0. So if I run this now, I'm sending 3 arguments, and the parameters are kind of like the placeholder variables. It's waiting to declare these. So when I call the function, it declares these, and it says, okay, color equals C, STX equals 0, STY equals 0, and then it feeds them in. And then these guys are like, oh, okay, now I got it. I take C. And these guys are like, oh, I'll take 0, and I'll take 0. So now they're going to filter in these values when you run the function or when you call the function. So let's do it. And there it is. And you can see it went faster that time. So that's how that works. And it's pretty brilliant the way it works, nice and fast like that. So again, we're sending in arguments and they're declaring these and saying, okay, this is C, this is 0, this is 0. And then these variables here are basically accepting those values. And notice we were able to use a variable here, send it as an argument, it goes up there, and then it goes in there. So we're using a variable inside a variable, which is fine. Now let's draw our second one, which is going to be over here. It's going to be cyan magenta. It's going to be magenta. Now think about where it's going to be. If this starts at 0, 0, this is going to start at negative 100, 0. The y is still going to be 0, but the x is going to be negative 100. And again, that's why we put the pen up, so it wouldn't draw a line over here. So we're going to make our second one over here, and we're going to do a second function call. So one function, multiple function calls. So this one's going to be draw square, except what's going to change now? Now what's going to change is instead of C, we're going to use M. And instead of 0, 0, we're going to use negative 100, 0. So I'm going to change this argument to negative 100. So we have 3 arguments, M, negative 100, 0, and they're going to fill them in the parameters, which are waiting for values. These guys are waiting for values. Now when I call this function, it's going to say, okay, color is M, STX is negative 100, and STY is 0. Go ahead, and it'll run through using these values. So now if I run this, we're going to run two functions, and it should move it over, and it should make a magenta square right here. And there it goes, and there it goes. Perfect. Now that we see that, that's pretty easy. So now when we want to make another one, we're just going to copy this. And make sure you click off, that blue thing isn't clicking off, because then it'll wipe it out when you paste. So I'll go here and I'll paste that. Now this one is going to be the Y one. So I'm going to change that argument to Y. Now this is going to be down here, so it's still going to be negative 100, and it's also going to be negative 100 moving down. So the X and the Y will be negative 100. So I'll change this one to negative 100. That's where the Y is going to go. And I shouldn't have to do anything else. See, how nice is this? You don't have to change the function at all. You're just changing these three things. And there's the cyan, there's the magenta, there's the yellow. And then the black will be just as simple. It'll just be a matter of making one more. And in this one, it's going to be at, the X is going to be 0, and the Y is still going to be at a negative 100. So on this last one here, the X is going to be 0, because the X always goes first. It's always X, Y. And again, a couple things to point out, and I'm going to make my stuff a little bit smaller here, just so you can see it kind of all together. So you can see my code all together. A couple things just to point out. If you have 3 parameters, you should have 3 arguments. They should match up. They should not be off balance, because if it's looking for 3 things up here, it's going to be looking for 3 down here. That's why you said, it'll say something like, well, you know, it's waiting for 3 arguments and only so many are given. So you have to give the same amount that it's waiting for. So if there's 3 up here that it's waiting for, you have to give 3 values. Okay, so that's just something with parameters and arguments you have to do. Now, one thing we're going to do is we're going to add some more stuff after this, and you might think, well, how many arguments can you keep going? Well, I think if you have like 4, 5, 6 arguments, it almost gets counterintuitive, because now you're keeping track of a lot of arguments, and maybe you'd be better off making another function and just using one argument or something. But we'll have to decide that. But right now, let's finish this one up, and we have our Y, and actually that shouldn't be Y down here. That should be black, which is K for CMYK, and it's 0 and it's negative 100. And let's run it. And there's our cyan, magenta, there's our yellow, and there's our black. And that's it, and that looks pretty good. So again, one function definition, 4 function calls using that. So that's all you have to do for this exercise. Actually, what we're going to do, I think in another little exercise, whether we call it 12b or something, or 13, I think what would be nice to think about, and you can even start thinking about it now, if you wanted to make, let's say we made little boxes that were kind of in the middle, like kind of straddled the middle here. Now you'd have to think about where they were located, which we can figure out. But let's say you wanted to make an R and a G and a B, and then maybe you put like a gray down here or something. We'll put 4 more colors, R, G, B, and maybe a gray. Now think about, how would you do that? Could we use the same function? Now what would change about that? Well, the position would change, and the colors would change, and would anything else change? Yes, the size would change. So we're going to have to think about that. That would mean we'd have to have 4 arguments. Is that too many? I don't know. We'll see. But we'd have to change this down here, because this is what controls the size down there. So this would have to change. That's only 1 argument. We might be able to get away with doing that in another exercise. So I think I'll just make it 12b, because it'll be real short, and we'll try to put R, G, B squares on here. But for this one, what you can do, since you're done with this, you have your cyan, magenta, yellow, and black squares, and hopefully you got a nice little introduction here to working with these. Hey, and you know what? One thing I just want to point out, one thing to point out here is, let's say you just, for example, you put in C here. I just want you to remember that if you put in C here, if you put anything else, but let's say I just put in Y. If I put Y in there, what that'll do is, even though I'm sending arguments, that will override it. So it's kind of like closest to it, because it doesn't, even if you're saying, hey, this is that, and CLR, this is basically saying, hey, CLR equals C, and CLR equals M, and CLR equals Y and K. It doesn't matter. When it gets to here, it's not finding any CLR, so it's just not going to apply it, because it's going to say, oh, you got Y here, just use Y. So keep in mind that, if you put the actual value there, it's going to override it. The actual value will override whatever you put in these. Just like if you ever had a variable and you didn't use the variable, you just didn't use the variable. So that's all that's happening here, is you're just not using the variable. But if you put CLR, now you're using it. So I just wanted to point that out before we leave. And that's the end of 12. Turtle Square CMYK. When you're done with it, what you want to do is just share it and scroll down to the bottom, copy the link, and then come to My Warren. Make sure you're logged in. Go to Coursework in Programming 1 and look for Unit 10. Look for Turtle Square CMYK and just go in here, just add a comment and insert link, paste your link, hit New Window, hit OK, and hit Save, and I'll see that you have a comment in there with a link, and I'll see when you put it in. So that's all you have to do with exercise 12. And after this, we'll probably put together a little 12B where we'll make those RGB squares, kind of adding on to that. We'll fork it, we'll add it on to that. But for right now, this is exercise 12.